Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac. I just want you all to know that Mac was very late to record this, so shame,
Yes, I'm
shame,
sorry. It's not technically it
shame.
wasn't my fault, but
I'm just kidding. I literally,
technically,
I literally right before this call, I was like, it's not a big deal, but I got to riz you a little bit on the
that's
pod.
fine.
But how you doing this week?
Been good. Looking forward to. Oh, I finally saw Zone of Interest, um, the new Jonathan Glazer film, which means I am 10 for 10 for Best Picture noms for the Oscars, which is very rare. I don't think I ever since 2008 with The Dark Knight when they bumped it up to like 9 or 10 or something. I don't think I've ever had a year where I've watched all of them. I've always been missing like one or two.
That's the one about the Nazis, right? The family who they live around a concentration camp.
Yeah, it's really good. The cinematography is excellent. The sound design is like amazing. It's almost like the film is sort of like it's almost like an experiment of sound design. And it's interesting. I think um, if we look at like other Holocaust films, the you could argue a lot of them are sort of sensationalized in the sense that like in order to I guess there are like two schools of it. One you could say is like, well, it was such a horrible violent period. We need to show that violence in order to kind of get across to people the severity of it. Um which to some extent I agree. However, um it does sort of cross into the realm of, is it being sensationalized? Is it being exploitative? Is the violence being used to like generate like almost like contrived emotional responses? Or yeah.
I didn't see Zone of Interest, but when I heard about what it was, like a natural comparison that popped into my mind was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas,
Hmm.
which a lot of people criticize that film for, um, like kind of like what you said, not being sensational. Because I actually don't think they show a lot of violence or anything in that film, but it's like it's meant to like elicit emotion from you in a way that I think a lot of people found cheap. Like like very like the story was constructed around this kind of plot twist at the end. It was really trying to hammer home a message. So, but I've heard good things about Zone of Interest. So, yeah, I think I don't think it's the same thing.
Yeah, no. Well, it's so like for example, the whole sort of like setup of it is it's the Auschwitz commandant. He is living with his family in in a little house right next to the camp. And in almost every scene or shot, you can see the camp just over like the wall of their garden or their little backyard area. And there's like one shot where like it's his family is all playing by this little pool in the backyard, and then in the background you don't actually see the train coming in, but you can see the steam rising from the train, so you can see it pulling in. um and so yeah, the whole movie there's no violence shown whatsoever, no, not even like disturbing imagery really. um and the point I think the film was trying to make was it was sort of like critiquing that idea of, if you watch Schindler's List, there's a lot of in your face violence. There are many graphic scenes that are just like in your face, showing the horror, um, the victims, everything. But I think this film's idea was, well, you know what's happening. You know what's happening just over that wall. So emotional, why would your emotional response be any different? And I thought that's sort of what the film was going for, and I thought it was very interesting. I think did it have to be, like, as long as it was? Could it have been, like, 20 minutes shorter? Probably, um, but I really liked the concept, that idea of it.
Yeah, I heard some people had some. There wasn't like I don't want to say controversy because that kind of overstates it, but I heard some people had some criticisms of it for like not showing stuff like that, like not like taking the focus away from the people who were actually suffering, which I think is a stupid idea overall. But it does kind of lead into what we wanted to talk about today, which was the sanitization of a lot of media, and the impetus of this conversation was the new Avatar series. So we had a whole episode where we talked about the live action adaptation and our thoughts on it. And I think we were both pretty positive on it for the most part. We really liked the design of the characters. It looked like pretty accurate, and we are both kind of excited to see it. But there's been a lot of statements made by the creators that have, like, I almost wonder if they're like intentionally torpedoing the show, because the statements they've released about the show are almost like, it seems like it's been explicitly designed to piss off people. Obviously, one was the latest one was the comparison to Game of Thrones. They're intentionally going to try to make it more like Game of Thrones, and people were very unhappy with that. But another big one was the fact that they have apparently rewrote some of the story elements to not feature sexism, particularly on Sokka's part, which was an early part of his character development. So, yeah, what were your thoughts about that?
I guess on one hand, I guess with the sexism, I mean, in retrospect, I did think it was kind of. It's not so much them removing it; it's the reasoning as to why they did. So, for example, if we look at like Sokka's sexism in the show, it really doesn't. It really isn't like that major of a plot point. He's like kind of like sexist at the beginning with Katara, and then by episode 4 is when they meet the Kyoshi warriors, and that's when he has his experience with Suki, and then by the end he kind of comes around, and then from then on there it doesn't really get brought up at all. Really, his main arc is more about becoming the leader, um, and so I guess like on that hand, it's like, well, it's not really that big or significant or huge of his arc, so is it okay to omit? And I think if like so for example, if it was a matter of like time, if it was a matter of like, just getting down to the bare essentials, I think that is something that could be removed. However, at least from the comments made by the showrunners, there it seemed like what they were saying was like, well, it seemed to it made it seem like they were worried that making him sexist would sort of like make him unlikable, or that even like portraying him say anything sexist would be viewed as like uh you know, too risque or too alienating, which is really strange because, like, in the show, it's not like he's even like, you know, he's not like Andrew Tate level or something like that. He's more like dopey 14-year-old boy, like boys rule, girls drill. Like it's basically that level of it. It's not like super severe or anything.
Yeah, and the really shitty thing about it is that, I mean, a lot of people were talking about him overcoming sexism being a big part of this character. I don't think that's really the case. Like, again, his arc is not really about overcoming sexism. Again, it's more about becoming a leader, like you said. So we don't really need that element. But what I liked so much about episode 4, the Kyoshi Warriors, was how quickly he resolved his sexism. Because you're right, in the first episode, I think he's got a couple of lines, of Katara, but that seemed more like a brother and sister kind of thing. It didn't really seem like he was putting down women or anything like that. In episode 4, when they meet the Kyoshi warriors, he has a little bit where he's like, yeah, you ladies are tough, but I'm a water tribe warrior. I'm better than you. And they school him real quick, and then he he pouts for like a second, and then he immediately comes back to them and is like, hey, I'm sorry I disrespected you. I'd love to learn from you. And I thought that was a very like mature way to handle it. Yeah, he was wrong. He learned from it very quick, and they accepted him back really quick too. They weren't like, again, there's a little bit of a joke on his part that he wears the women's battle attire or whatever, but it's not really even making fun of him. It's not like humiliating him for being a man or anything like that. Like, Aang has one little joke about it, but other than that, it's kind of like a respect thing. They're like, hey, you want to learn from us here, like, wear our traditional attire. Um so I found that even though it's not a necessary part of the story, I found it very well written and very enjoyable and refreshing to see. So it's kind of a shame to lose that, even if we don't necessarily need to have it for the story.
Yeah, and to your point, it's like, well, it's interesting because you on one hand, I guess you could argue it's like, well, does Sokka kind of does he overcome his sexism, his sexist views too quickly? Is it kind of sanitized for children? And I guess like on one hand, you could say like it does happen pretty quickly. It's more of like a very like sort of like kid friendly version of it. It's not like a dude learning to like taking years to like unlearn all the toxic masculinity. It's like no, it's just a dopey boy and he gets showed up and he learns his lesson. Um, but on the other hand, is that at least in from what I've read in terms of you know for people who are either like homophobic or for people who are transphobic or anything like that, or they're sort of like uncomfortable with the idea, they've shown that like once those people actually interact with like if they have like if a friend of theirs comes out as gay or they actually meet and talk to a trans person, that is such a huge, it's like one of the biggest thing that kind of make them see almost immediately, oh yeah, you're not some like psycho pervert or something. You're just a just a chill dude. And that just that like sort of like casual interaction goes a long way into changing people's attitudes. And so yeah, so with Sokka, it's like it's not like he was like, again, it's not like that he has like a burning resentment for women or he hates them or anything. It's just that he was like, that was his entire life. He's a 14-year-old kid. That's all he's seen. It's all he's known. And then as soon as he goes to a place where that's not the case, as soon as you step out of that environment and go here and you see that women can fend for themselves, it, it's a pretty quick wake up call in his case.
I don't think it's a huge part of his character overall like that, because some people were saying something about like, you remember the Serpent's Pass when they meet up with Suki again in the second season, and he's kind of being protective of her and like, don't lay over there because you might fall off the cliff or whatever. And some people were linking that to his like early sexism, and that's not really the case. It's more so like he was traumatized that his first girlfriend, the princess in the North tribe, had died, and he was kind of protective of Suki because of that. So again, I don't think it's a critical part of his character at all, and I think it was more so just a fun little interaction for them to have. And it seemed another statement that they released that pissed a lot of people off was they're like, we're cutting a lot of the tangential stuff because we need to focus on telling a really cohesive story. And people are pissed off because Avatar has a lot of these side stuff that a lot of people consider to be the best parts of the show. And even if I can understand from the showrunner's perspective of like, we don't have all the time in the world to tell the story, so we have to kind of pick and choose what we do. I don't understand why they framed it like that. It's like, why would you even say something like you must have known, like if you know the Avatar fan base at all, you must have known that this would piss people off. It'd be one thing if we were watching the show and it's like, oh, they cut that. Like, I get why, but it would have been nice to show it. But to kind of preemptively say that, like, hey, yeah, we're cutting all this fun stuff and just trying to make this show more like a Game of Thrones action adventure thing. It's like, again, it almost seems like they're intentionally torpedoing the show's reputation right before it comes out.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because like there is a lot of like filler stuff in the original anime that probably could be cut out. The fortune teller, the Great Divide, stuff like that. Like those are episodes that you don't really need to include. They don't really come back at all. They're pretty I'm sure fans was like, oh, it would be kind of cool to see that in live action if you're gonna do it. But if there's like stuff that you do need to cut out, that's the stuff. And then it's funny because like we actually did the math of, because it is only 8 episodes, but each episode is an hour long. So if you do the math, 22 minutes per episode, 8 episodes, each of an hour. So it comes out to about like the entire like first season is about 8 hours, roughly thereabouts. Um, but yeah, I think it's more about because each one's an hour, they can't do that thing where they're like, oh, we're just gonna stop by here, pop in, do something, and then leave. So yeah, I'm not really, that wasn't really my biggest gripe. It was more of like the whole like it was like weird. It was like, well, we have to balance that between people who liked Game of Thrones. And it was like, well, I'm pretty sure most Atla fans, if you were like an Atla fan when you were a kid, you're probably a Game of Thrones fan. Like it's not about like, oh, it's a kid show, adult show. It's more about, no, it's like it was telling a very coherent story focused on character. So yeah, if you were an Atla fan, I imagine you probably were a Game of Thrones fan. I don't think it's mutually exclusive in that regard.
Yeah, but again, it's just worrying that like that's their kind of mentality going into it again. And I can understand some of these things conceptually, like as a showrunner, you have to kind of think about like how do we reach the widest audience possible. Avatar is very popular, but it is a Nickelodeon show. It doesn't have the the numbers that something like Game of Thrones has, right? That has this huge, across all demographics, appeal and viewer numbers to match that. So I can get that, but again, I don't know if it's just like they were in an interview and they were caught off notice, but I would like if I was the showrunner, I would be more guarded about this stuff. I would phrase stuff in a way that I would know how the Avatar fan base would react to it. And it kind of like sounds to me that whoever is running this thing doesn't really understand them. And again, the original creators of Avatar left this project; they're not involved at all because they were unhappy with a lot of the decisions. And people brought that up early on. And I didn't pay it too much mind at first, but as more and more statements come out, I'm starting to get a little bit more worried about that. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. And it's weird too, because like I'm always. I mean, this is like sort of the similar argument with like the whole True Detective stuff, where it's like on one hand, people are like, it's like, well, it doesn't like, it's not like faithful to like True Detective or to the vibe or whatever that means. And on one hand, I'm like, yeah, it's not good. But on the other, I'm kind of like, well, maybe that is good. Maybe it is, we do want to kind of do our own thing. We want to step away. Um, so I understand that. And the same thing with Atla, where it's like, particularly, I saw this when I was doing, when I made my video and I got all the comments back. I did feel there was a very like, the fandom particularly is very like, you know, it, I mean, obviously there are people who were like, who are good faith about it. They have like a measured take on the show, but then there are others who I ran into who were just like, no, there's nothing wrong with this show. Even the stuff you brought up is like, no, here's why you're wrong. Um, and I wonder if it's like, but then at the same time, it's like, okay, so what do you? I understand the idea that like, well, why do we need this at all? Which is fair, but if we're gonna do it, maybe it is good that it isn't exactly one to one to the anime. Because like, do you just want it to be a repeat, everything exactly the same from the anime? I don't know. I think that's sort of an issue with like live action adaptations, where it's like, what exactly does the fandom want? Um, so yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But damn,
I think it's about keeping the spirit of things as much as you can, even if it doesn't translate exactly one to one. Again, that's what I really loved about all the designs. I was like, oh, they actually made the characters look as close as they would in real life to what the characters in the cartoon look like. And a lot of again, it seemed like a lot of media recently has gone against that. They're like, no, this looks too stupid. Like, I mean, again, I'm not a big comic book guy or whatever, superhero films, but how long did it take to get Wolverine in the yellow jumpsuit? I think it's just this newest Deadpool or whatever, and people were like, "Oh, cool, he's finally in his iconic outfit from the comic books." And it just seems like a lot of media. Maybe that can be owed to like the Dark Knight and the early early X-Men films and stuff like that that kind of set this precedent that no, let's not go with the comic book aesthetic. Let's not go with the cartoon aesthetic. Let's make this like super realistic. Let's design a bat suit as how it would look like if it was actually designed by like a paramilitary company or whatever. Um, and it was refreshing to see like the Batman film that we watched the first episode we did of this podcast where they kind of leaned more into like let's just make the suit look kind of again the more kind of goofy-ish kind of comic book look to it rather than being like every single aspect has to be scientifically explained how this works. And again, maybe that's the reason why a lot of this stuff has turned out the way it did.
yeah. And then there's like, so I kind of brought that up originally because from what it seemed like, and then another comment was the idea that like, oh, we're gonna tone down some of Katara's, her motherly vibes, from the show, and it's like, well, I mean, I guess you could argue that, well, no, because the whole point of that, like her sort of like taking on that motherly role, is as a result of the trauma of her losing her mother. She kind of had to. She didn't really get a chance to be a kid. She kind of had to step into that motherly role very early on. And from the way they framed it, it made it almost sound like, and this is another thing that's sort of like I'm worried about, where it's like the way they framed it, it almost made it sound like we can't show her in like a motherly caring role because that's almost like too much of a female stereotype. And it's like there are plenty of characters in the show, like Toph or Suki or Azula, who are very, I guess you could say, traditionally non uh, feminine. I guess, even though I think that's kind of stupid. But with Katara, it's like, and this is sort of like I get worried when we're talking about like feminism and you know women and entering the workplace and all that. It's I'm all for women doing whatever they please, but it seems like there's another subset of people who almost like they demonize women who do want to or enjoy taking on a more traditionally feminine role. And it's like that's kind of missing the whole point of what, you know, feminism or whatever was fighting for.
Yeah, there is this kind of backlash against like people are scared of portraying something in a way that they would be accused of like sexism or racism or homophobia, even if that's the natural case. Like, there was this story recently about this guy who I God, I'm forgetting all the details, but it was a famous person who was sexually assaulted, and they were doing a movie based on her story, and they wanted to change the race of the person who assaulted her because they were like scared of reinforcing stereotypes, even though this is the factual thing of what happened. But the reason the story was interesting because again, the guy who was like producing it or show writing it or something, really disagreed with that, and it kind of led him down this rabbit hole where he found that the person who was arrested for the crime wasn't the one who actually committed it, and this person got freed after being in jail for years. I need to
Damn.
when you start talking, I'll look it up what it was, but um, it was a very it was a famous story, and but again, the point there was that the that studio that was making it or whatever was was scared of showing the truth. Like, this is the person who, like, the color of the person who attacked her, but they were again scared of the backlash they would get of being accused of racism or promoting stereotypes.
Damn. That's insane. But you don't know, or off the top of your head, you don't remember what the case was.
I'll look it up later. I had to like Google it again. It was someone who was semi famous, like a famous writer or something. I'll put it if I remember to put it. Sometimes I say I'm gonna put it in the video and I forget to do it, but if I remember, I'll flash like the article or whatever that I read. But it was a writer who was sexually assaulted, and she filed a police report. They arrested someone. He went to jail, but they later found it was not the right person.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and the
It's funny because
justice was delivered thanks
yeah.
to the producer or whatever pushing back against this kind of, again, it's a loaded word, but against this kind of woke, like, thought process that goes into, well, we can't show someone of this color doing this because that's that's potential that people would accuse us of racism.
Well, see, that's sort of like the thing where like that is something where I would say if we're going to use like if we're going to try and take a term like woke and like sort of um give it an actual meaning, that's a case where I think, okay, the fact that you're taking a true story and you're uncomfortable about portraying the true events because you think it's going to like make you personally look racist or people are going to get mad at you, I think that is a perfect example of like, I mean, and like, or wasn't there, we've talked about it, wasn't there a Harvard professor who said some shit like The Wire is bad because it shows black people as like drug dealers or something?
That's that's a perfect example I want to bring up, which was
Yeah.
The Wire accurately portrayed this, right? It showed that most of the drug dealing was done by black people. Sure, there was, white people in season 2 or whatever, but it showed that this was a problem that, affected the African American community. It didn't pull any punches in that regard, but it showed that, like, hey, this is a complicated issue that involves the government, it involves, outside influences, it involves good people on both sides, good cops, bad cops, involve this whole thing. And that's how you portray issues like this. And that was one of the sad things about this Avatar thing, which was, it showed sexism existed, but it didn't do it in a cartoonish way. It showed that, like, hey, yeah, Sokka's got some, sexist belief, but he overcomes it, and that's a good thing. And we're going to show things how they actually are. And again, it's a kid's cartoon, so it's not that big a deal either way. But That's the shame in shows and movies and stuff, not wanting to even address stuff like this or show it in an accurate way, because then you're not even dealing with the issue. Oh, by the way, you can go ahead and talk, but it was Alice Sebold, the writer of The Lovely Bones.
Okay, I think I remember hearing about whispers about this.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
That's I just looked up who it was, but that's what happened. They were making a movie based on her experience or show or whatever, and that's what led to this person being freed.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that. Yeah, so it's like so funny enough, I remember last time we were talking about abandoned projects, and this is actually a project that I um was going to do, like maybe like make a short video on it. This is gonna be a shot in the dark. Have you ever seen if you've seen Disney Channel original movies, have you ever seen Eddie's $1,000,000 Cook-Off?
Yes. I
Yeah?
used to
Fuck
watch I
yeah.
used to watch all the early, like, Nickelodeon, Disney, like, those made for TV kind of bullshit movies that were still really, like, enjoyable as a kid. Yeah, I know that
Hell
one.
yeah.
He's a baseball player or whatever, and he wants to start going into cooking. Yeah.
Yes. And so yeah, so the plot is Eddie, he's like a star baseball player. His dad's the coach. He has two older brothers who are very like broy. Um, and his friends, like they're all like into baseball, like that's his thing, that's his identity. But then he discovers that he actually loves to cook. And something that I so when I rewatched the movie recently, what was interesting was that I was surprised that the film was very explicit in the reasons as to why his father and his brothers, particularly his father, were against him doing going against like not being into cooking. And it was because like in his eyes it was girly. It was a girl thing. It wasn't a masculine thing. I don't think they said anything like they alluded that he was like, "Oh, what are you, a gay boy?" I don't think they said anything like that because it was Disney, but they did like explicitly say stuff like, "No, it's a girl thing. That's girly. You don't do that. Boys don't do that." And I was kind of surprised that I'm like, this was a very blunt exploration of like, yeah, this is what young boys this age actually go through. They maybe find a passion for something and they're told that like, oh, that's girly. That's not what men do, or that's gay or stuff like that. Like very not like, off, people are pretty explicit about it. They can be very mean and harsh about it. Um and what was interesting is because I've also seen High School Musical because my girlfriend like she loved those movies growing up. Um, and what was interesting is that the plot of the first High School Musical was somewhat similar. Troy Bolton, Zac Efron, he's a basketball player, is the star. His dad's the coach, and he's into musical theater and he wants to do sing and dance and stuff like that. And what was interesting is when I rewatched the movie, at no point did it was it a matter of like there was no like mention of like sexism or like, oh, don't do that, that's a girl thing, or because you're a man, guys don't do that. It was all
It
it
was
was
more
like weird.
tribal. It was
Yeah, it
more
was
like the
weird.
base the basketball players were like, "We don't associate with, drama," and the drama people were like, "We don't associate with you," and there's a whole scene where they're all switching tables in the lunchroom or whatever, and it's like yeah, it was more a tribal
The
thing than a
status
sexism.
quo
Yeah,
and
the status quo,
yeah.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
And it was really strange because like there were multiple scenes with the father and the son and they were like arguing, and at no point, and like it got to the point where it's almost like ridiculous, where it was like at no point was the father like realistically, and again, I don't want to like, again, it is sort of like a shame, but at no point the father was like, don't be a little gay boy, like that's for chicks, like you fucking pussy. Like that's realistically, if a father was against that for his son, that's probably what the context is going to be. And so it was just kind of weird where it was like that the father was so upset about it, but it's like, no, because you're a basketball player, that's your identity. It was just,
Well, I
it
think
felt
it was
like,
something about he wanted him to get a scholarship from basketball. That's how they framed it in the film. Like he's like, "This is your ticket to go into a good college and a
yeah,
career, or whatever," rather than drama. So yeah, I think they were scared at that point of making it kind of sexist thing or a homophobic thing or something like that, which is equally stupid though because he one of the reasons why he wants to do it is because of the girl, right? It's uh
yeah, right. It's
the
kind of ironic.
whatever the girl I can't remember her name, whatever the actress, Vanessa Hudgens. That's what he was interested in, right? He was like interested in her, and he wanted to do the play to go get with her. So
Yeah, I think it was kind of both, but yeah. But yeah, it was just very strange where it was like it almost was like the movie they want, or not even the father, but even his friends. Like at no point was the friend like, "Don't do that. Like that's girl shit." It was really almost bizarre how sanitized they were. So afraid of like the character can't be have hold these sexist views, even if he overcomes them later. It's weird. Yeah, like you said, it's weirdly like a tribalism thing. It was like bizarre. I don't know.
yeah, in terms, I think a lot of shows, especially nowadays, are trying to avoid topics like that. And I will say, if there's a choice between avoiding the issue and portraying it badly, I would rather you avoid it than portray it badly.
That's
There
a good
are
point, yeah.
there is an argument to be made that like something like cartoons like Avatar could get away with this more, where does something like Hey Arnold deal with the racial issues in an inner city neighborhood like theirs does? No, it does not at all. Right? It doesn't need to. It's a cartoon. There are lessons in it. Don't get me wrong, but it's a cartoon made to be enjoyed by kids. It doesn't have to deal with like, yeah, there's an episode of Hey Arnold that one of their neighbors is selling crack out of the boarding house. Like that's not. We don't have to deal with every single issue and every single piece of media, right?
Well, to be fair though, do you remember it's like one of the most famous ones. Do you remember the episode where it's the Christmas episode and Mr. Wynn, who's the
Yeah,
Asian man, and
yeah,
they find his daughter? I
yeah,
didn't re- I didn't realize it. They depict the
yeah,
evacuation of Saigon,
yeah,
which
yeah,
was insane. I was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
"Holy fuck." And of course, I
yeah.
didn't realize that when I was a
Of
kid, but
course, yeah.
yeah.
And again, yeah. So again, shows can touch on those things, and Hey Arnold did touch on a lot of stuff. It touched on depression and isolation with the Pigeon Man episode. That was a great one. I love Hey Arnold. It's my
That
favorite
was a
cartoon of
really
all
good.
time.
That's an
So
awesome
like
episode.
again, it dealt with those shows, but it didn't need to deal with every single issue, right? There's no gang war in the neighborhood of Hey Arnold or whatever. So not all shows have to deal with them, and you can avoid those issues and not have to address it. And I would rather that though than the problem with a lot of media, like we talked about last episode, which is the things they get accused of being woke is they try to touch on these issues, but they do it in such a poor way. Like they make these very straw men characters who to espouse the opposite views, they can just be destroyed and eviscerated. And in Avatar, if they were going to do something sexist like that, they would have like this really sexist, vile character who Katara and Toph and all the girls come together to beat the fuck out of, and he never learns his lesson. And they don't do anything like that because that's very poor writing. When they dealt with sexism, they dealt with it in a very realistic and mature way. When they dealt with any of these issues like genocide in the third episode, which again apparently sexism is not okay, but they're leaning full head ahead with the genocide
Yeah,
aspect.
not sure what the thought process is there, but um, yeah, and it's funny too because like I think that's another issue why where the whole like woke conversation kind of goes off the rails because like yeah, so it's a perfect example in Avatar. Sokka is sexist, but he's not a bad person. He holds sexist views and he needs to sort of like learn the error of his ways, but it doesn't come off as if he's like I'm an evil person and I'm gonna take
They're
the
very
women down.
normal sex. They're just like it's not even like the word sexist almost doesn't feel right to describe it. He's just like again, like you said before, he's just a 14-year-old boy. That's kind of thing is completely normal for someone like him.
He's been influenced by stereotypes. Even Paku later on, Master Pak, he it wasn't so much that like again, like you consider like obviously is he being like, you know, dunderheaded? Sure. But it's like he was raised in this environment. It's not like he came out of the born and like, haha, I'm gonna oppress women. Like, no, it's just their customs. Um, and I think that is like to your point, some people don't think that those two because that's the majority if we're talking about sexism or racism, the majority of instances of it, individual instances or even structural, are very they're passive like that. They're done by people who probably aren't really racist or sexist. They aren't evil or they aren't mean or mean spirited. They just, they might hold certain views that are certain whatever. Um so yeah, this idea that you have to frame someone who is sexist as like a bad person, like like a mean person who does not deserve
Only
redemption.
bad people could be sexist, only bad people could
Yeah.
be racist or whatever. That's what a lot of media tries to do, and that's really poor writing.
And what's interesting is that on that regard, I think that people who are like, more liberal minded or left leaning, they should look at that and be upset because they're simplifying the ideas of racism and sexism to such a hilarious, hilariously inept degree. However, the issue is there. So, like, you and I could be, that's probably why we would be upset about it. It's like, it's not that you're portraying this, it's that you're doing it in a way that kind of betrays the actual nature of sexism and racism. But then the issue is that then there are some people who I think criticize, like, so for example, they're probably mad at this, they're mad at an instance of showing sexism on a show like that, but they're not upset for the reasons that we're talking about. They're upset just because they think that the show is pushing, anti-sexism or anti-racism or something. And that's where I think it can kind of get a little bit murky, where it's like, similar to the whole like Disney LGBT characters, where it's like you and I are probably upset about that shit because it's like we know you guys are doing this for clout. You're not respecting these characters. You're just doing it. If you want to make a movie with like an actual like representation, go for it, and we'll enjoy it. But then there are people who just don't like seeing gay people on in the movies, and so it's like we agree, but not for the same reasons. And I don't want it's hard because like okay, I don't want you to think that like we're on the same side here because we're really not.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it goes both ways in that regard, and that's the. I mean, the frustrating part of any kind of media discourse is that you have on either end these extreme views that you know that like to fight over all these single issues, and it makes it very hard to discuss like this stuff in good faith with people. It's just like I think like True Detective, we both had our problems with it. I don't know if you've been keeping up with it. I actually haven't watched a lot of it, and the things I've seen so far have made me not be super excited about this show. But again, I don't think it's because it's Jodie Foster or whatever. I think it's the issues that the show has are probably just writing issues in general.
Yeah, and that's what's so weird about it is like I agree it's poorly written in many ways. I mean, but again, I would make the same argument with that's again I think we're talking about this sort of like revisionism of like oh it's because Pizzolatto isn't involved. It's like yeah, but he wrote season 2. You can't we can't use that excuse. Season 3 was pretty sort of like boring for most of it. Again, the ending was awesome, but for the most part, it was just kind of boring, kind of like okay, let's go. Um, and yeah, it's like okay, we can critique the poor writing, but then when you kind of take an extra step and you start to say, well, the writing is bad because they're trying to push and like, well, hang on, if you're gonna make a claim like that, you really have to back it up.
Yeah, and again, it could be bad if they're writing these like straw men characters and they're tackling these issues in a very poor way. But these issues absolutely can be explored in a very responsible and very well written way. Again, The Wire is the like quite possibly the greatest show of all time, and it absolutely tackled all of this stuff, and it showed how complicated they can be. Characters could be good people and have flawed views and stuff like that, or they could have great views but be flawed in other ways, right? There can be characters who were very progressive in a lot of ways but were ineffective in other ways, people like Carcetti and stuff like Carcetti was not a racist on the show. Like he actively was like trying like to when his friends would make jokes about that, he'd be like, don't do that, don't talk about these people like that. But he's a piece of shit in other ways, right? He's a scumbag politician, but he's just not a racist one. So again, like you can absolutely do great character work without simplifying people into these cardboard stereotypes in either direction.
Yeah, and it's funny too because like depending on I know obviously like we've talked about before where people are like woke doesn't really have a definition, but I think the one they usually use is like the general one, which I don't really buy, but they say it's like woke is defined by believing that all inequality is due to structural issues. And it's funny because, like, by that token, The Wire is the single wokest show that has ever existed, because the entire thesis of that show is that all these people are just cogs in a machine. They might have they make different choices. They make, you know, they might get out of it, they might not. But at the end of the day, it's they're being they have the society around them has a stranglehold on them, and that's what takes them down. But of course, if you say that, they're like, "No," and it's like, well, no,
I
it's
mean, there don't get me wrong, there are some absolute idiot people out there who are like, yeah, unironically say The Wire is woke, and it's not for that reason you just said. It's for the fact that the show has black characters and gay characters, and like very prominently in the show. So there are idiots out there, but I think anyone with a brain would look at The Wire. And again, Wire has its problems, don't get me wrong. There's stuff I don't like about the show, but it's a master class that you can portray issues accurately and realistically, and still again come away from it with these characters are flawed human beings, but very much enjoyable to watch, even the absolute villains.
funny enough. I don't know if we've actually ever touched upon this. I think we've touched. I mean, we did with True Detective season one last um, episode or the episode before. Um, taking something that is viewed as like a masterpiece and like, because yeah, I feel like that True Detective season one something where it's like, no, it has its flaws, and you should be able to talk about them. What are your like major flaws with The Wire? Would you say, aside from, I mean, I guess there's some obvious ones like season five and stuff like that, but
I mean, it's season 5 in a lot of ways. I mean, there's some. I mean, maybe there's some criticisms to be made of the earlier seasons. We did a Wire episode, didn't we? Talk about anything we didn't like about it.
I don't remember. I don't think so.
I think one of the things we talked about was, is the show like propaganda? Is it like pushing
Yes,
this
that was
issue
it.
that like a bunch of which I don't agree with. At least if I'm remembering what the argument was. I think it's exactly like you said. The show showed that like the systems in play are much deeper than like the police. Like, yes, the drug war is a destructive force for Baltimore and maybe America in general. But the cops are not driving that. Like, even the politicians are in some ways not driving that, right? It's like these things go deeper than even those people. So yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, again, the main problems I have with the show are probably season 5, which was for a number of reasons. I think primarily the lack of Ed Burns being involved, because he was starting to work on Generation Kill, which is an absolute masterpiece. I cannot recommend Generation Kill enough. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But it felt like the writing went downhill a little bit in season 5.
Yeah, and of course, like I kind of went over it in my video, like um, the the shortened season. You have to wrap everything up. You have to kind of follow season four, which was many would claim to be the best season of television ever. Um, yeah, about the cop again. I think the idea was like, and I guess like Law and Order and whatever, a lot of shows sort of have this issue too, where it's like it sort of framed for The Wire, it framed the cops as like they're trying to do good. They really like deep down, they really want to do good and serve justice, but they're being hindered. Whereas like a show like The Shield is a show where like the cops really don't care, like or sort of like their view of justice can be warped by their perspective. And it's like, yeah, did it maybe like uh did it make the cops of The Wire, or at least maybe not all of them, like there are some like a bunch of scumbag cops in it, but like the main cast, like McNulty, Kima, Lester, did it make these people sort of heroic in a sense? Yes. Um,
Yeah, but
but it also
I wouldn't say that. I think most cops do want to do good. Like, I know that's a very controversial thing to say. I get accused of being a law enforcement shill all the time ever since I did that
a
Hank
Blue Lives
video.
Matter.
Yeah, I've been accused of being that guy. Well, because my family's in law enforcement too. But I think most cops do want to do good. Like, there's obviously bad ones, and The Wire showed there were bad cops. There was Officer Walker who broke a kid's finger just because he pissed him off and stuff like that. So and someone like Hawk or Hulk. God, I'm blanking on the name,
Oh,
but
Herc.
Sorry, Herc. God damn it. I did a whole 4-hour video on The Wire. But there's someone like him who is just a meathead and, you know, wants to do good too in a general sense, but is just kind of too stupid to really care about the consequences of his actions. So I think The Wire realistically showed that, but I think most cops probably do want to do good. It whether they're hindered or not. I mean, it's I think most people on earth want to do good in general with their lives.
Or at least general like what they might perceive as good. That was a
Yeah.
big uh, theme of like the Shield, where it was like
Yeah.
Vic's view of justice was sort of, in many ways, he was correct. Like there were a lot of scumbags, but then there were others where he like the ends justify the means view
Yeah.
kind of took him in weird directions.
Yeah.
Um, and even I would even say like the one praise of season 5 as many problems as it does have is the fact that McNulty, despite that the fact that he's framed as completely dysfunctional, but at the end of the day, he really is framed, especially in the earlier seasons, season 1, 2, and 3. He's framed as, or especially season 1, he's framed as a character who's like, no, but he wants to do what true justice.
Yeah.
However, as the show goes on, particularly in season 3, following spoilers for The Wire season 3. Um, Following Stringer's death,
Yeah.
and particularly in season 5, you also get this sense, and this is what David Simon said about McNulty, was that yes, he wants to do good, but is there also a very like egotistical, self-serving nature
Oh, it
to his
absolutely
actions?
was. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's more about getting Stringer, like
Yeah.
after Stringer was dead, he was pissed because Stringer didn't know that he caught him.
Yeah.
It's like, aren't shouldn't you be happy about this that you
Yeah.
beat him? It's like, no, because I wanted
Yeah.
to be the guy to beat him. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and those two ideas are not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly. Good way to put
McNulty
it.
McNulty what like he cared about the community. He was active in it. He knew the individual people on the streets. He could, he was raised by Bunny Colvin, who is the greatest cop in the world, in my opinion. The greatest, probably my favorite character of all time of any media is Bunny Colvin. But he was raised on that belief. But yeah, he absolutely had this egotistical side, and but I don't think the show ever excused him for that. Like they actively called him out on that throughout the series, and
Yeah.
the finale uh, puts a pin in this idea that the ends justify the means, because they break all these rules in order to get Marlo Stanfield, but they don't end up getting him because they broke the rules and it doesn't happen. And again, maybe one criticism I could have of season 5 that too is bringing Lester into that plot maybe kind of hurts his character a little bit, because he was the one who was like about true justice and doing the right thing, and he wasn't really egotistically motivated. But in season 5, he kind of was.
That's probably my biggest one is I could see McNulty doing it. I could see him do. Was it a bit contrived? Was it a bit rushed? Yes. But like, okay, like, maybe I could see him do that if given enough development. But when Lester is just like down with it, I was like,
So quickly too. He didn't even
so
think about
like,
it. He's like, "Yeah, I'm
no.
I'm down to do this." And I mean, again, you can make the justification that like he spent 20 years in the pawn unit and he was eager to do something worthwhile with the few years he had left. But yeah, I think that's one of the weaker points of season 5. Beyond just the very silly serial killer storyline at times too.
Yeah. Other than that, I'm trying to think. I don't really have any like individual.
I think season 2 has the effect that like it's been shit on so much by casual viewers that I think the community has gone the opposite route, where they're like, no, season 2 is like the best season of all time. It's just you don't understand it. And I agree to an extent. Season 2 is really underrated for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of great stuff in there about the working class, about the downfall of the industrialized America and how that's affecting people. I think there's a lot of great stuff in season 2. I don't think it's perfect. I think we could have incorporated it back into the season 1 elements a little bit more, in a way that's not, that's not obtuse, where it's not, you know a completely, like, it's meant to be a little bit more self-contained than the rest of the seasons, but I think we could have weaved those elements a little bit in there more, and I think it would have made the season a little bit more enjoyable for the casual viewer too.
But to kind of like circle it back, the because I know we got on wire tangents, but yeah, like that's sort of what I'm afraid of when it comes to like, because like I'm thinking back to like my days of like watching like Smart Guy or Boy Meets World, and there was some pretty heavy shit. Like Smart Guy, there was an episode where TJ and his friend were being groomed by like a predator. He would invite them over to like play video games, and it was like, and again, I didn't really like put two and two together, but I was like kind of like thinking back, I'm like, oh my, holy shit, this was like on Disney Channel. Of course, and then of course, ironically, they'll show that episode, but then the episode where Corey and Sean get drunk in Boy Meets World, which is supposed to show the dangers of alcohol consumption. No, we couldn't show that one. It's like, okay,
The censorship rules about shows is so fucking weird. Again, violence totally okay, sex absolutely not, and again, that goes deep into the culture of America. Yeah, uh, I think that addressing these issues, if they're done well, can be enjoyable, especially for kids too. I remember really enjoying the Avatar story again about the like I said, the seeing Sokka kind of like learn to respect those warriors was like, I thought that was a really cool character moment even when I was a little kid. And so I think, and we just talked about Hey Arnold and all the, interesting stuff it did with its show. I think that we don't give kids enough credit for what they can handle in shows. Like obviously, it's a kid show in general, but if it's well written and it's responsible, I think it can be a great thing to address stuff like this. And in many ways, it can be many people's favorite episodes and favorite topics.
yeah, and it's such a shame because it's like this is the sort of stuff like me if we're watching a show where like say the example I used of like kids being groomed by a predator, it's like we're adults, we know what's going on, but that is even more important probably, and even the Sokka's episode with the Kyoshi Warriors, these are important. The whole point of these episodes is to teach kids, to kind of open them up to these perspectives. And it seems like sometimes I worry that like a lot of children's media is like, oh no, we have to shield them from this. We don't, because these are too mature. It's like, but the it's kind of useless because like one, they're going to get older and rewatch it, and it's like, well, I'm already older, I don't need this anymore. Or two, they're without these examples, they're going to hold on to these um bad attitudes or like sort of like closed off perspectives well into their childhoods. Yeah, I can't. I'm trying to think of like. I mean, again, I'm not like super up to date on children's, programming, but like, I really don't think it does feel like it's changed to an extent.
And again, when you say teach kids lessons, the natural thing people are going to come back with is you're trying to indoctrinate my kids with your beliefs, and the answer is absolutely yes. Like all
Yeah,
media, this is not a new thing. This is not new. All media is propaganda in a way, for or against anything. This is not a recent invention of woke whatever. It's like you go back and look at old shit. Even stuff like The Sopranos has liberal ideologies in it. Like it's just kind of more well disguised.
well
So
executed. Yeah.
it's not new that like when a writer writes something and they have a belief, that belief is going to shine through in the work. Again, you can be for or against it. And I think it's also fair to like I think we don't give kids enough credit where they're like, oh, if they're exposed to this woke ideology, they'll become trans or whatever. And I think no, I think that if they individually don't believe in the thing you just said, they won't believe in it. Like or they might believe in it for a while, but later they'll change their mind. There's a lot of sh- there were lessons in cartoons I watched back in the day that I don't agree with anymore. Characters who I sympathized with when I was a lot younger, who growing up I don't look the same way at them. I kind of judge them a little bit differently, having gone through the experiences that I do with. I This is a stupid example, but one of those is SpongeBob, right? When you're a kid, you naturally sympathize with SpongeBob, but when you get older, you start to sympathize with Squidward, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, no, he did nothing wrong. There's a reason Squidward is like this because he's a cashier. in going in his midlife. So I think I don't think we should be scared to. People are not as fragile as they make it out to be, and they're not like, yes, obviously there are people you can be influenced by stuff, and that can be good or bad either way. But I tend to think that like people are responsible for their own beliefs, and exposing them to different beliefs is a good thing. I think that it helps people form their own opinions about who they are and their opinions about the world.
Yeah. And it's weird too, because like to your point, it's like, oh, you're trying to like indoctrinate my kids. It's like, well, yeah, but I feel like that's probably good in some cases. Like, again, it's probably good um for children to be wary of like, hey, is this adult trying to like groom us or something? Or like even with Sokka, it's like, hey, is it good for boys to sort of like be introduced to the idea that girls can do boy things and vice versa? Yes. Um, yeah, and I feel like a lot of people like that tell on themselves where they're like, it's like to some extent, if if it's something like if someone's trying to like push religion or a certain philosophy or something like that, that's one thing. But if it's something like it's like I don't want you to teach my kids not to take like candy from strangers, it's almost like okay, you're kind
I
of
mean, that's not the one they're railing against
obviously
that
yeah,
much.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
they're railing against you're teaching my kid racism is bad, but
But then it's like well,
But
it's
the
like
but even
hang on,
no, but here's the thing though, even if that's your opinion, like, do you know how many like racist people there are nowadays who grew up watching shows that were like racism is bad or whatever? There were shows like cartoons like that throughout the 80s, like and 70s even. Like the idea that like just watching that one cartoon will completely change your worldview. Like, no, I mean, there are plenty of people who rejected that view. So again, I don't think people are fragile as fragile as they make them out to be.
yeah. Well, it's weird. It's weird too, where it's like this idea that people are either when we're talking about audiences in general, it's like it's almost condescending in the sense where it's like, well, we don't want to show this to the audience because they can't handle it. And it's like that and that was sort of like the whole point of the Avatar video was that the reason Avatar was such a big thing for children's media was because it was, aimed a kids show, was aimed at that demographic, but it didn't treat them like they were like these like it had a higher opinion of the children it was aimed at to the point where even adults um could like even I was watching it, it's like this is going into some pretty heavy stuff. But yeah, it's almost and again to kind of go back to our point about like people if they do hold sexist or racist views doesn't mean that they're like inherently bad people. I don't think these people who kind of like do sort of sanitize media, particularly children's media, I don't think they're not doing it. They're doing it with the best interest in heart. They are doing it. Their hearts are in the right place, but they kind of don't realize it's like, don't you realize that you're kind of being very condescending to children in the sense of like, oh, this is Sokka being kind of an airhead when it comes to like girls. You can't handle that. That's like too risque. It's like you don't think like kids this age are going to have already been exposed to that? Come on.
I think the same level of sympathy should be extended to the people who write stuff like that. Like again, people like to have this conspiracy that like, oh, there's people, like these blue-haired people pushing their beliefs on us through the media, and it's like, yes, but I don't think it's like a conspiracy, like a sure in some cases maybe, but I think again, writers just have beliefs, and those beliefs are going to naturally pop through in their writing. So again, a lot of people have this like conspiracy, like whenever they see any kind of ideology in a show or a movie, they imagine as someone like being very like again doing the hand thing, like being very sinister as they write it, being like, I'm going to brainwash people with my beliefs in this cartoon. It's like I don't, for the most part, I don't think that's true. I think they're trying to write the best thing they can, and what naturally comes out are their beliefs. And sure, in some cases I would like them to refine the idea more, but I don't think it really amounts to like conspiracy or anything like that.
Yeah. And 9 times out of 10 people on both sides of the aisle, when they agree with it, it's not propaganda. But when they funny enough, I was just oh my god, what was it? We were just talking about I was at the bar, and I think I overheard someone talking about it, and I think I talked to them a bit about it. They were sort of talking about how so when we use the term propaganda, technically, the term propaganda is sort of like a neutral term where it just means any sort of media that pushes some sort of position, political or social or otherwise. Um, so technically, by that metric, a good chunk of all media is to some extent
Well,
propaganda
they don't
under
they
that
say that. They
definition.
say all
Yeah,
art is political. Like
yeah. Well,
there is no art that does not have some kind of ideology behind it, whether some are stronger than others, some are weaker than others and how much they push it, but I don't think you can get away from that.
yeah. Even if something this was like a big controversy when Far Cry 5 came out. Did you play Far Cry 5?
No, but I know it's you talk it's
It's
the
yeah.
The America one.
Yeah, it takes place in like like the Midwest or something, and there's like a cult, and a lot of people thought it was going to touch upon like Trumpers and stuff like that, but the game didn't, and then it got criticized. So then the argument is like, is the game being apolitical? Is that in itself a political stance? And to some extent, I think I can kind of see that. Um, but yeah, so like I think the sort of like more like general when people hear propaganda, what they're sort of thinking of in a more specific context is a piece of media that's being to your point where it was like very caricatures of like all racists are like these really bad people who deserve to be like derided, and it's like they can't be like they're ostensibly good people, and they just have some like regressive beliefs that they need to. And you can if you reach out to them, maybe they'll start to like come around and change their ways. But instead, it's like no, these are actually like these are people sent to Earth from Satan himself to cause us pain, and they need to be eradicated. It's like no, that's too simplistic.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, again, I think that to your point, it's propaganda when it's something you don't believe, and it's not propaganda when it's something you do. So,
Yeah, or indoctrination is if I don't agree with it, it's indoctrinate. Yeah,
yeah, and people across like both sides of the aisle are absolutely guilty of that. But yeah, we are at our hour here. Any final parting thoughts you want to leave us with?
I am still being optimistic for the Atla live action. I will be watching it. I probably will be giving my thoughts on it.
Oh, I'll definitely watch it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm kind of I don't know. Now I'm a bit. I guess I'm more like now I'm more curious. It seems like we're from the sound of it. They're like, yeah, we're taking out like a bunch of the things you think it's gonna be. So now I'm kind of like, okay, now I guess I'm more like morbidly curious as to like, so what is the show going to be like?
I will absolutely watch it, and I'm still relatively interested in it. The one I'm actually kind of hesitant about was True Detective season 4, just because the stuff that I've not watched an episode. I was kind of planning on watching them all once they all came out, but the stuff that I saw about how it connects to and the spoiler alert, but how it connects to season 1 made me like groan. I was like, "Oh God, you're doing this? You're really doing this?" And that made me kind of be like not super interested. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. It really depends on and that's like why a lot of people like I see people sort of like they're even coming at me, they're like, "Don't you think it's cringe?" I'm like, "Yeah, kind of." But it really depends on how it's going to play out. Is it going to like tie in utterly, or is it just going to be a bunch of kind of like Easter eggs? So that's I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. Same with Avatar. I'm going to give it the BOTD. When it's all over, then I'll give my unadulterated thoughts on it.
Of course. Anyway, thank you guys for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode of No One's a Critic coming soon.
Take care, y'all.